It's really important, particularly in today's climate of acknowledging racism. It must be understood that oppression and marginalization of any racial group is never acceptable. And we should not overlook the racism in our children's educational system via mascots. We are the only race that's used for mascots, right alongside animals, chosen professions like cowboys and patriots, and races that are not oppressed minorities like Vikings, imaginary beings like leprechauns. Native Americans are the last accepted vestige of overt racism in this country, and I would even say celebrated racism.
There are over 40 schools in Massachusetts that use stereotypical and harmful representations of Native Americans as mascots. We need a change, and the time is now.
It's important to shift attention to our white privilege and how it plays out in our town. One of the things that has felt inconsistent and unjust about the town is the mascot of the Medfield warrior, which is a depiction of a Native American face wearing a war bonnet, which we know is not actually historically accurate for the indigenous folks whose land we currently occupy here in Medfield.
To have what I would consider a caricature defining an image of a culture, young minds have actually pointed out they themselves clearly learned elsewhere. They had to learn this information elsewhere, that the headdress alone was inappropriate, the manner in which those headdresses would be worn by particular people in those particular tribes, which are very far from this region.
I think what's interesting about the warriors for Medfield is that, in fact, they wouldn't have to be warriors if their land wasn't taken from them, essentially robbed from them.
When I was in high school, I had no idea that Medfield is the traditional land of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts peoples, that they are still the traditional stewards and custodians of the land. I never thought about what it meant to be a warrior, and the fact that Indigenous people wouldn't have had to be warriors if their land wasn't systematically stolen from them when they were pushed further, out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the violence that they faced because of it. None of that was made clear to me, that we're occupying territory that isn't ours.
And the specific event that our town mascot and half of our town seal derives from is especially tragic. It's based on a particular moment, a 1676 raid by Nipmuc and possibly Wampanoag fighters during King Philip's War, which was one of the deadliest wars in American history. Half the town was destroyed, over a dozen people were killed, folks were captured and never seen again. It was a grim day for the town in particular, but it was followed by an even more cataclysmic period for the native peoples who eventually lost that war. Friendly Nipmuc non-combatants were concentrated onto Deer Island in Boston Harbor to freeze and starve during a relentless icy winter. Native fighters were killed and had their bodies dismembered and publicly displayed as gruesome war trophies, sometimes for years. New Englanders sold thousands of able-bodied warrior-age men into slavery all around the world. Barbados actually had to pass legislation to outlaw New England Indian slaves because there were so many coming in and they had a reputation to rebel. Others, perhaps including some of those who had raided Medfield, were shipped across the Atlantic as slaves to build the breakwaters for harbors in North Africa. This is an awful, tragic history. We shouldn't use the mascot to wrap this legacy of violence in a blanket of romantic town nostalgia.
Part of the problem with making these changes is you need to have reference. And in order to do so, you need to have something, obviously, to base your decision-making upon. You can't just obviously focus on your own agenda and views. So education is a component that is necessary for any sustaining change.
And I do believe that this is an opportunity for us to reach a common goal. We can satisfy this together. If you want to honor Indigenous peoples, reach out to us and ask what you can do to help in our current issues. If you want to remember Indigenous history, then teach it accurately, whether it is painful or not. If you want to support and represent Native people, contact Indigenous representatives and see how they can get involved with you.
You must work in creating curriculum in your education and create reciprocal, lasting relationships with the local tribes. These questions regarding the use of mascots will have answers that will become apparent once the education and relationships begin.
We must ban all Native mascots. It is a mockery. It is a mockery of our strength and of our bravery, and we cannot stand for it anymore.
Well, we're holding a sign that says, I am a human being, not a mascot. People will get so outraged by that. And it's like, you're mocking my culture. Why is it that you're so upset by that? If anyone should be upset, it should be me.
It's like you're putting us on as a costume and you're saying that you're us without dealing with the whole experience of being us, without living with the intergenerational trauma and these lasting effects of colonization and attempted genocide and our high rates of addiction and disease and all that sort of thing. Putting on Indian like a costume and then taking it off is something harmful to actual Indigenous people.
The privilege is that you can, use these images and cheer for your team and be proud of your team, but yet you can put that away at the end of the day and take that off as a costume, whereas we can't.
That kind of representation in an educational setting, it just leads to more widespread and acceptable stereotyping and biases. And so that leads Native students struggling and non-Native students with only the stereotypes about who we are. And those portrayals create biases that dramatically affect our outcomes because we have the highest rates of murder, sexual assault, suicide, incarceration, death from police brutality. And it can be really hard to visualize a future with yourself in it when you're facing this kind of erasure and violence.
I think it's very degrading that a culture who literally outlawed us from speaking our language. I'm using a foreign language right now to communicate with people who are on my ancestral land. And that's something that I have to face every day that I'm sure many people do not, again, take into these considerations when they're having these conversations. But on top of it, to have these mockeries put in your face that our existence is not even valid unless I'm wearing a headdress or unless I eat buffalo or unless I live in a teepee. I mean, like, these are the kinds of stereotypes that should have been gone away in the 50s, but unfortunately they're still being reinforced.
As a physician, I know how harmful stereotypical mascots can be for Indigenous people's mental health.
By continuing to utilize the stereotypical mascot imagery, despite the plea of over thousands of Native American organizations and advocates, to me equates with doing intentional harm, as it's really actively inflicting suffering on a people who have been oppressed and persecuted throughout history. I wanted to repeat, I was going to talk about the studies that have been done, kind of looking at the psychological effects of Native American mascots on Indigenous people, regardless of whether, the people who have those mascots feel that it's to honor Native Americans. The mascots do induce and correlate with negative psychosocial outcomes. Studies have shown that they generate negative psychological effects for Native students, lower self-esteem, lower community worth, less capacity to generate achievement-related possible selves, and greater levels of negative affect. And in particular, the research reveals that Native mascots are associated with negative thoughts and stereotypes about Native Americans, and that exposure to Native mascots increases negative stereotyping. And so I feel that keeping the mascot is not only a humanitarian issue, but it's really a public health issue as well.
Native students in schools with harmful mascots feel unsafe and unwelcome, which is a civil rights violation. And civil rights are not up for popular vote.
Research shows that Native mascots can actually raise the self-esteem of non-Native people and lower the self-esteem of Native people. So that's talking about these kids in schools, including Native kids. Using these mascots will discourage Medfield students in understanding the larger reclamation movement that is multifaceted and happening all across our continent and others. And more locally, so that you understand, at least on our continent, Indigenous people are working to restore traditions and languages. We're searching for missing women and children. We're fighting to hold on to and protect what little of our homelands we have left. The reality that we face goes far beyond the mascot.
I found the evidence against logos like ours is overwhelming, including from the National Congress of American Indians. They've actually been advocating for the removal of these types of logos since 1968. That's 52 years. Let's just let that settle in for a moment. Native American mascots are also, once again, a statewide issue, and I work closely with our state legislatures, and I'm following these bills that will prohibit Native American mascots in the public schools in our state.
What this mascot bill says is very simple. No Massachusetts school, not one, shall have a Native American mascot or symbol or name.
The bill did receive favorable committee report out of the Joint Committee on Education. It's now one step closer to a vote on the House and Senate floors. The bill was co-created by the 5 federally and state recognized tribes in Massachusetts, and the 3 statewide recognized Wampanoag groups also wrote letters for this bill. So for those who say they want to hear from local tribes, I'd say that the tribes have already declared their opposition to depictions of Native Americans as mascots.
The National Congress of American Indians, the NCAI, as they recently gave a letter of support to the Massachusetts bill to remove mascots from high schools. And there are currently over 145 tribal government, educational, professional, and civil rights and religious organizations in the United States that have recognized this. And the tribes in Massachusetts, I'm going to say them. This includes the Chappaquiddick tribe of the Wampanoag Nation, Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe, Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, Massachusetts tribe at Punkapaug, and Nipmuc nations.
I just encourage people to look at the historical facts first before saying this belongs to you, because it doesn't. This is our identity.
I don't think that pride is about kind of like meaninglessly clinging on to things like symbols. I mean, pride is very much about pushing the thing you love to be better. And if we want to have actual pride in Medfield and the Warriors, we need to be challenging the things that we believe, and the things that we thought were right.
You will not be losing identity. You will not be losing memories. Rather, you will gain community spirit and community of cooperation coming together to create a mascot and name that everyone can truly be proud of. And remember, we're always going to be proud of our children, even if they are aardvarks or otters.
Look at it as a new beginning, because you can find a mascot and a name that fits your community, and it's not racist.
When you change the mascot, you're still going to be proud of your school. You're still going to be proud of your families and your traditions and your excellence in athletics and all of that. You're going to have a new mascot that you can actually feel good about, that reflects who you are. I promise you, there is life after these mascots, and it's better. It's like a weight has lifted. You don't have this controversy. You're not harming people.
I'm hoping that our students, past and present, will come up with a new design that honors the spirit of Medfield, that makes it such a special place.
How might we develop a fresh and inclusive identity for our schools that reflects our hopes for the future and nurtures a sense of community togetherness and empowering our young people? Many of us have already participated in effective versions of this through the townwide master planning process and other public meetings on complex issues. It's time to create something that lifts up and inspires our community while not simultaneously denigrating another community. We can and should remove this logo.
We are sending our kids into a world where they will be amongst much diversity. And they're going to come to the harsh reality that they will not be able to wear their Medfield Warriors hat or shirt with pride, because it will no longer be socially acceptable. I believe that Medfield has the right people to do the right thing. Let's give our children a mascot that they will wear with pride always. As parents, guardians, and educators, we should provide our children not only with the tools to be successful, also with awareness for the success of others.
It's time for Medfield to be a part of the change, to start listening to what is right rather than remain in the convenience of the status quo. By changing the mascot, Medfield can personify the change that needs to happen in many aspects of American society. Change grounded in newfound respect and understanding for all people, especially those in minority races. Although we can't change the way our ancestors and the founders of America treated the Native American people, we can change the way our generation, as well as future generations, understand the culture of a group of people who have left a massive impact on the world that we live in now. We must focus on fixing the future rather than repairing the past, so that all people can not only be represented, but represented in the right and respectful ways. Changing the mascot is the first step Medfield can take in doing this. Thank you.